Hi, this is Claire and Landon. We're doing our group presentation for children's ministry, and we're doing it based off of the book. Our topic is worship, and we're doing it based off the book Parenting in the Pews by Robbie Castleman. And this book is all about how to teach your children how to worship in an adult service, teaching them at a young age how to have a real relationship with God and a meaningful relationship with God and an intentional relationship with God. So starting in chapter 1, Robbie talks about how the church they were attending was across the street from a daycare where she sent her kids during the day. And she talked about the value of watching her children from a distance to see how they dealt with people. Whether it was dealing with their friends or their teachers or just dealing with themselves, how they acted when she wasn't around. And one of the things that she noticed was that her oldest son tended to play by himself a lot. He didn't really play with a lot of people, and he didn't mind to play by himself, but that was just something that he did. But when he did play with other people, he was the leader. He liked to take charge in the games. But she said one of the important things about watching your kids from a distance is being able to watch for signs of emerging gifts like leadership or prayer or things like that. And you also get to learn about their personalities as separate from you, because we all have different personalities according to who we're with or who we're around. So the first section of chapter 1 talks about paying attention pays off. And one of the things that the author really drives here is that paying attention is not always easy, but it's essential to teaching your children and to being effective when you teach your children how to worship God. And the second thing is that teaching children to pay attention to God is essential. And so when you pay attention to your child and when you pay attention to God, your child will learn through example how to pay attention to God as well. The second section is called Petticoats and Passing Notes. And the verse that she takes to sum up this whole section is Psalms 46:10. Be still and know that I am God. And this is really a good key point in this section, because it talks about how your kids come into the sanctuary, and sometimes it's easier to put them into like a kid's sanctuary and just let the children's ministers take care of them or teach them or whatever. But you have to have your kids with you in order for them to grow. And so be still and know that I am God. It's just talking about having patience in this process and being still to recognize God. So the difference between going to church and going to worship is one of the things that she really drills in this section. She talks about there's a difference between going to church just to go to church and going to church because you want to worship God. And one of the quotes that I've got from her is that going to worship requires a life transformation and happens out of a new heart, not an old habit. Going to church can be nothing more than smart time management with good intentions. It may not have much to do at all with worship. And I thought this was really, maybe not profound, but it really stood out to me how a lot of times people do go to church out of habit. I mean, they could just get caught up in the routine and the mundane of going to church, and they don't really think about, why am I going to church? Am I going to church to be intentional with God, or am I going to church just to go to church? So the third section is called Just Going to Church. And she starts the section off with the question, why do we go to church? And she lists some of the reasons why people might go to church, and one of those is promises. Like if you make a promise to your parents or your grandparents or your friends that you'll go to church with them, that's one reason why people go to church. Sameness is another reason, just to be the same as everyone else. You know, if Landon goes to church, I'm going to go to church because Landon goes to church and I want to be like Landon. Help. People go to church for help. If you have like a crisis in your family, or if you're going through a personal crisis, you might turn to the church for help with that. And most people go to church just because it's the right thing to do. Like, they were brought up in church, and they know that you should go to church, and they know that it's part of being a Christian, and that's why they go. They don't go to worship God. They don't go to be intentional with Him. They just go because they know that's the right thing to do. So worship is the right reason, but it doesn't always come naturally to us as humans. And that's one of the things that Robbie says in her book, is that it's hard sometimes to get into the swing of going to church for worship when you're used to going simply to do the right thing, or because you've promised your friends that you'll go to church with them. Worship doesn't always come naturally to us because we can be prideful, and we can be selfish, and we can be self-centered, and we forget that God is supposed to be our primary source. God is supposed to be the reason why we do everything in our lives, that our whole lives center around God. And as humans, we forget that a lot. The fourth section is wanted training for worship. Dr. Dobson Answers Your Questions is a book that she quotes. And two of the primary questions that she pulls from Dr. Dobson's book is the first, is he learning to behave properly in church or God's house? And two, is he learning to keep the Lord's Day holy? The only proper behavior for church is worship. We go to church for community and communion with each other, but we ultimately go to worship Christ. We set aside a whole day of not working and resting and being one with Christ. That's what Sundays are set apart for. And we have to teach our children to make the most use of our church time by worshiping.
Okay, so chapter 2 is called The Differences Between BC and AD in Worship. So in this, she says that BC is before children, AD is after diapers. So obviously, if you're going to church, it's going to be a lot easier to focus on what's going on in worship when you don't have children. So in this, she kind of she emphasizes how important children are in worship and how God cherishes that. One thing she says is a quote. It says, "Worship is first a blessing to God, and He values the presence and praise of children." So the first section in this chapter, she really talks about the meaning of worship and how worship is a challenge, that we have to work to worship, that it's not going to come just naturally, that there's going to be so many distractions going on that we have to be able to really sit down and focus on what's going on in the worship and in our worship and in our hearts. And it's a challenge just for a regular person, but then once you add children into that equation, it becomes an even bigger challenge. She goes on to say, she quotes another author in which he says, "People worship their work and play at their worship." Many people feel as though worship is just kind of just going through the motions, and everything else in their life is much more important than the worship. So we kind of treat it less than what it is and what it should be treated as. The Hebrews, they have the same word for worship as service. And this is another point that she makes, that many people feel that there's a difference between a worship service and a worship experience. It's like they're going to go to the experience because that's what they're going to get out of it. And a service is kind of a chore, and that's what they feel like. But she lays it right here, that the Hebrew word for worship is the exact same as the word for service, and that we are called to that. We're called to worship, and in that we're called to serve, really, to serve Christ and give Him that worship. The next point that she makes in this section is about children and how they learn. Children learn through participation, practice, and patience. She uses the example of certain sports, how they learn through practicing and how there has to be patience when they're trying to learn that sport, and they have to be able to participate in it, and how there is a coach that is really teaching them what to do. And in worship with our children, we are the coaches. We are supposed to include our children and be patient with them as they're learning to worship. It's important that we don't get angry when we're trying to worship and they're asking what's going on or something like that. We are their teachers and we're their coaches, so we have to train them up in that. So the next section in this chapter is about motivation, and it really reflects on us as the parents, as the teachers. It's really, are we motivated to do what we need to do in that moment? If you don't have a deep motivation for training your children to worship, participation is going to be hollow, practice will be inconsistent, and patience will be non-existent. So this has to do with us. We have to go in this with the attitude of we're ready to teach our children about this thing that they're going to have to learn. I know there was one point in the book where she talked about how that her and her husband just got married and moved to a church in Louisiana, and she didn't like it. It's not that she didn't like the people or anything, but she wasn't a fan of the church as a whole. It was her first time having to sit on wooden pews. She couldn't take her shoes off during service. She didn't like having a bulletin telling her when to stand up, when to sit down, when she could pray, when she was to sing. She didn't like that. She wasn't used to that. So in that, she began to feel as though she hated the church and hated the worship. So she talks about how she called up one of her mentors, and basically her mentor was like, people in the old church, they worshiped in prisons because they were arrested for it. Why can't you do this? So that is really what this section is about. It's about teaching us that we have to be open to worship before we can really teach our children to. So the next section of this chapter is the challenge of worship. As I said before, worship's hard. Worship's a challenge. The challenge of worship is to sense yourself more fully in God's presence. All else is set aside, and this time is special to spend time with Jesus. But in today's world, that can get really hectic. It's really hard to forget about everything that is going on outside and just spend time with Jesus, especially when we have, jobs, when we have schoolwork, when we have, the child's baseball game going on tomorrow night. When we have all this stuff, it's hard to really sit down and focus completely on Jesus. But she says that to set that time aside is to give children a sense of passion, and that is to worship in spirit and in truth. So a great deal of parenting in the pew is allowing our children to see us celebrate. So a challenge for us is going to be able to worship freely in that moment. That our children are going to see that, and they're gonna pick up on that, and it's going to teach them to worship. If our hearts are fixed on being with our children before the Lord, we will experience freedom. And she says this as kind of a reminder that it shouldn't be a nuisance for our children to be in worship with us. But we should count it as, the way I see it is as family worship. We're all together as one before God worshiping, and that should bring a sense of freedom.
Okay, chapter 3 was called Praising Puppies. And the first thing she's talking about, or this whole chapter really is talking about the capability of children to participate in worship. The first thing that she really talks about is that children believe. Children are a symbol of the kingdom, indeed the greatest in the kingdom. And this is talked about in Matthew, and in the Old Testament it's talked about that children are really counted as blessings. And in the New Testament, Jesus calls the little children to him. He doesn't deny the children to come to him, but he calls them to him instead. But another thing that she really talks about is children remind us what it is to be great believers. When children are really young, they don't have any reason not to believe that God is alive. They don't have any reason to question that he is and who he is and what he is to them. They just have to be taught who he is. And once they're taught that, they don't have any question to believe that. So children are a reminder of what it is to be great believers. They don't have any doubt. The third point within this chapter that I pulled is children are willing to believe, and that means that they have a capacity for worship. So just like children don't have any doubt, they're also willing to believe, and they want to have something to believe. They don't question what you tell them. They trust. They're born trusting people. So the second section out of this little chapter is called Children Respond. Sometimes an encounter with God may not always look like one at first. And she was talking about how they were talking about how God thinks about all the aspects of your life and how God cares about everything in your life. And so they were saying a little prayer, and one of her kids says, God thinks about my dog. God knows about my dog. And that was a really big moment for that child, because he was like, wow, God cares enough about me to know about my dog and to care about my dog. And we can take advantage of those moments and use them to really prove that God cares, and to really invest in that child's worship and relationship with God. So the third point is that children belong. Children can belong in a morning service. Sunday school programs should not be put in place because parents don't have the energy, or they don't want to teach their kids how to worship and to participate in a Sunday service. And this is one of the things she talks about all through the book. But children can belong in a worship service on Sunday morning. They don't have to be sent off. And I think the author would actually argue that they should be included in part of the Sunday morning worship service for the adults, because if you send them off just to be dealt with and just to be tolerated somewhere else, then they're never going to learn to worship, and they're never going to learn a real relationship with Christ until you put that experience in front of them. And the fourth point is that children can help. And this is really, she's talking about how children can help you pay attention to what God is really saying. And so she mentions a story of one Sunday morning service. Her husband was giving a sermon about missions, and he kind of asked a rhetorical question like, who wants to go to, wherever. And one of the kids in the sanctuary said, I'll go if my mom lets me. And so that was just kind of an eye-opening moment. The willingness of that child to go to do mission work was really impactful. And I think it caught people's attention and was like, wow, if this kid gets it, then I should be paying attention,
Okay, so the next chapter 4, it really talks about preparing for worship and preparing for church. She says that Sunday mornings begin Saturday night. So this is really a section that is really practical, that everybody can really apply these things as they get ready for Sunday morning, because she says that if Sunday morning, if it's smooth getting to church, it's going to be an easier time to get your kids to focus and worship. So in today's culture, getting children to the worship place is often as far as we get to helping them worship. Sometimes I know for some of my friends who have kids, and even for like my uncles, getting their kids to church is a hassle, and that's, by the time they get there, they're wore out and exhausted. I know every Sunday my pastor comes up and he's like, yeah, Kristen's over there wrestling up the kids. It's going to be a long one. And I don't think it has to be that way. So, and in this chapter, she really gives us some practical ways to make that easier on us. So, she first says that we need to look at Sundays different, not like it's just any other day. So she compares it to birthday cake. And with birthday cake, birthday cake is special. You plan for a birthday cake. You're ready for a birthday cake. But with any other cake, you can just eat that any day. But a birthday cake is special in that moment. That is a birthday cake. It's not just any every other day cake. And she says that we need to look at Sundays like it's a birthday cake. We prepare for birthday cake. We make arrangements for the birthday cake. We're ready for it. And we have to we have to prepare for Sunday mornings. We have to be ready for Sunday mornings. So 2 ways that she says we can do this is preparation of the heart and preparation of the home. So preparation of the heart is really within us, is what we have to do. When we're parents, this is what we're going to have to do. You have to be eager and excited to get ready to go and share this worship experience with your kids. If you are not excited, if you're not looking forward to it, if you're exhausted, they're going to pick up on that. And in turn, that's kind of going to make them zone out as well. In preparation of the home, what you have to do is basically be ready, be prepared. She talks about laying clothes out Saturday nights to where that morning isn't going to be as hassled and as rough. She talks about getting your tithes ready, and then also teaching your kids whether it is the tithes or whether it's a tip for the church. There's so many things that she talks about in this section, but it's really just summed up in be ready, and if necessary, be ready the night before, because Sunday morning begins on Saturday night.
So chapter 5 starts off with, I'm going to start with a quote. She says, "When worship is unusual or different, then it usually holds the attention of our children longer. The idea that successful worship is entertaining is not considered outlandish in our culture, but worship as entertainment will not accelerate the spiritual growth of our children." So this whole chapter here is about actually being with your kids in the service. And in the first piece that I just told you about, she's talking about how worship can be entertaining, but if the sole goal of worship is to be entertainment, then you've missed the mark somewhere. Worship was not meant as entertainment. It was not originally done as entertainment, and it should never be done as entertainment. Worship is a matter of the heart, not a matter of excitement or hype. And in the quote, she says, "But worship as entertainment will not accelerate the spiritual growth of our children." So we have to be careful that worship doesn't become a form of entertainment, but that it's something serious and intentional that our children do and that we teach our children to do. Children are keenly aware of spiritual needs. And this was something that she talked about. They long for forgiveness. When they've done something wrong, they long for forgiveness. They feel guilt when they've let someone down. And these are all things that pertain to salvation, like repentance. These are all mirroring that idea of repentance and forgiveness that Christ offers us in salvation. So the first thing you have to do is to be with your child. You have to pay attention in worship to be able to train your child in the pew. That was one of the first things she said was important, because children get distracted very easily, whether they're sitting with you or whether they're sitting with their friends. But she says that it's really not a good idea, and she personally didn't let her kids sit with their friends during Sundays, like the Sunday morning service, because it's really easy when you're with your friends to get distracted. Whether you're talking or you're just giggling or whatever, but it's really easy when you're with your friends to get distracted. And so when you're with your parents, they can, calm you down or, say, be quiet, let's pay attention or whatever. But it is true that young people find security in having rules that don't budge. And so she was talking about when you set a rule that your kid cannot sit with other kids or with their friends in church, you have to stick by that rule forever. It has to be like an indefinite thing. And I think this really goes to all rules that you set. Once you set a rule, you have to stick to the rule. Like, you can't change it according to a circumstance that comes up or whatever. You have to be definite about your rules, and you have to be intentional about your rules. So, being in the sanctuary, children's church can be very helpful if it's designed to train children in worship. And here she's kind of advocating for children's service, but only if the children's service has the intention of teaching your child how to worship, because if they're not getting that in the big kids, or sorry, not in the big kids, but in the adults worship service, then they need to be getting that somewhere else. The third is being attentive, helping kids stay in the church service. Oh, okay. Here are some things that she gives us to help keep your kids in the church service, because we know there are a lot of distraction in it. One of the things she says is like, it's amazing how many teenagers and how many kids all of a sudden have to go to the bathroom during the long part of a service. And so some of the rules that she set for her family were like, you do not get water before this service, between Sunday school and the main service. You don't get water. You do go to the bathroom between Sunday school and the main service. All your electronics and your coins, your colored pencils, your crayons, anything that can be distracting to your child should stay at home. You don't want to pacify your kid by offering them toys or your phone or whatever during service. You want to make sure that they understand that that's not a place and a time for electronics or toys or games, but that the main service of a church service is to worship and is to pay attention. You have to be intentional about making that a strong point in your family. And there really shouldn't be any distractions for the kids. Of course, there are always going to be distractions that you can't control, but you should try to limit the distractions as much as you can on your end. So the fourth and the final thing, the final section in this chapter, was being quiet. Simply telling the child to be quiet will not be enough to teach them how to zone into worship. The purpose of keeping a child in the sanctuary is not to teach them to be quiet, but to teach them to worship. So she talks about how, kids have a really short attention span. So there's always going to be times when they get rowdy or, they get a little fidgety. And so the thing that she talks about is redirection. You have to redirect your child back to the main service. You have to redirect your child to pay attention. You can't just tell them, be quiet, and then brush them off, or be quiet and not pay attention to them. But if they have a question, maybe whisper an answer, or answer it after church, but don't completely disregard your child.
Okay, so chapter 6 is titled Make a Joyful Noise, and it really is about engaging your children in the music part of a worship service. And it gives a lot of practical tips that parents can do to help their children learn how to worship through music. So she makes a point to say that good Christian music is a good way to get teens to learn in a new way. Many of them, she's speaking to teens specifically, but many of them aren't going to really necessarily pay attention to the message, but they can learn a lot of things through music, which can then lead to conversations and questions and just a lot of other things. So she tells us that it's important that we start teaching our children at a young age to sing songs to God. And I'm just going to go through a few ways, I think maybe 6 ways that she says that we can work to teach our kids this. So the first one is, if the words are on the screen or overhead, have the church print out pages for ages 10 and under with the lyrics on it. And she says that it's important to print out these pages for the kids 10 and under, because if they have a page in their hand, they're going to be more focused on that, and they're not necessarily going to focus on a screen that is 50 feet in front of them. Just as a really practical way to get your kids to really look at the words of the song. So the second way that she says to get children specifically to learn to sing songs is to sing the same song. She says that if possible, try to talk to your worship pastor or even your head pastor and see if it's possible, if for the kids in the service you can sing one hymnal stays the same throughout each service for that month. For some people this could get really repetitive, but for children, when they hear something that they've heard over and over, they're gonna sing it, they're gonna know it, and it's gonna help them learn that. The third thing that she says, this is aimed at teens. It's important that they know the history of the song. It's important that they know what the song is about. A lot of hymns specifically come out of a time of heartache and troubles for the writer. So she says that if the teens see that, it kind of evokes a deeper understanding and a deeper meaning for them, to how good God really is. And of course, it's important that they know what they're singing about from a biblical perspective, that they understand, okay, they're singing this is coming from the Psalms, what was happening here, etc. So the next way that she says that we can get children involved in the music part of the worship service is to make them feel involved. And this can come simply from having them hold the hymnal, or in a lot of modern churches, have them stand on the chairs so that they can see the screen, or pick them up so they can see the screen, but make them feel like they're not just going to be sitting there throughout the entire worship, so that they actually feel like they belong there. Okay, so the next way is, it's aimed at parents, and is sing in a way that your children can hear you and help guide them. So this can either be, if you're using a hymnal, gather your children around and sing where they can hear you singing, and use your finger to guide along at what words you're at. And that's just really, really practical, kind of self-explanatory. It teaches them how to use, if you're in a church that uses a hymnal, it teaches them how to use that. It teaches them the song. It teaches them the words. And then finally, the third thing that is really helpful, I believe, is to teach kids to listen to certain phrases of certain songs and to sing those. So if they're unable to learn the entire song, just teach them to listen for when one certain thing comes in and have them sing that, with their full hearts. So for example, mighty to save. So Savior, he can move the mountains, my God is, and then they would say, mighty to save, he is mighty to save. And of course that's gonna be kind of fun for them. They're listening for a certain thing, but also it really teaches them, it teaches them that song, because they're listening to the whole thing, waiting for the one thing to come in. So she goes on to say that most church services will have like an instrumental kind of thing, whether it be an offertory or a special music. She advises parents to have their children listen to that and imagine what they think is going on. Because in a lot of the instrumentals that are played in these times, you can almost close your eyes and picture something for yourself. Whether it be you picture a moment in your life where you really felt God's grace on you, or